So given a choice of subject to present, I said, well, I'd like to talk about this if that's okay, and thank you for the permission to do so, and appreciate the opportunity to be here to speak and all the work that goes into this study. So this is about interactions with multiple cups brethren. And I'll get to that. I want to do a little bit of history to help us understand multiple cups and talk about that from a perspective of some who may not have thought about these things. The restoration journey of following the scriptures and of depending upon the scriptures, that was a slow and difficult journey, because deciding to only follow the Bible, that does not happen easily. It doesn't happen quickly. So Bible truths were, quote, discovered slowly as religious beliefs and practices were compared to the scriptures. And if you read the history of some of the restorers, you'll see what an agonizing journey that was and how long it took for them. Ultimately, they had to decide, do the scriptures have authority or not? Do they have authority in my life? And they faced the issue of, if the scriptures have authority, which testament do I follow? Do I follow the Old Testament, the New? Read about what happened to Campbell when he talked about that we do not follow the Old Testament law. That was a huge shock in his day. And we don't think of such things today. Are there patterns to follow? Are there absolutes to believe? Are there absolutes to practice? Dare we draw lines of fellowship in areas where God has spoken? Have you ever faced an audience where you looked at a whole bunch of people and say, in the New Testament church, there is no tithe? And they look at each other, it's like, what have you said? What have you done? The world is full of religions that mix the testaments. We don't think of stuff like that. Well, the restorers faced issues of what authority do we follow and how do we do that? So it was early in the 1800s when Thomas Campbell spoke with where the Bible speaks, we speak, where it is silent, we are silent. And saying those words is quite easy. Deciding to practice them requires a tremendous commitment then and now. So here's what we declare, I think. We are people of the book. And that means we start with the scriptures. We learn what they say, we do what they authorize, and we reject everything else. And I don't mean for that to sound cold and blunt. I mean for that to sound warm and fuzzy, but sometimes it can be very difficult. Have you ever looked at somebody that says to you, I am an apostle? Meaning, you will honor me as an apostle. Meaning, don't you have money for me? And if you come back warm and fuzzy and say, well, I'll give you a little bit of rupees, I'll give you a few shillings, then you've just aided and abetted in false doctrine. Or do you look somebody like that in the eye when they say, praise the Lord, which around the world, by the way, that greeting, praise the Lord, that is code for, I know what my religion is and how I am esteemed, and if you will say that back to me, you are telling me I am a great man of God. So whenever I meet somebody in India that says, praise the Lord, I say, hello. And they say, what? And then they go around and say, is he going to give me money? Like, no. So the praise the Lord greetings that we think, oh, that's just a religious statement, it's wonderful, and we can be warm and fuzzy in return. No, that is absolutely a false doctrine being thrown in our face. And if we respond with those words that otherwise are true and great and that we believe with all of our heart, we are encouraging somebody in that false doctrine. And so yes, we are people of the book, but how does that book apply? And how do we apply it in situations that we encounter? And what happens when we encounter situations we've never seen before? Innovation's path is a lot easier than the path of truth. Because in innovation's path, truth really doesn't get in the way for very long. Here's the way it goes. First, you begin a practice that is desired for some supposedly good reason. After that, you find a scripture that justifies the practice. After that, you then justify and defend that change with passion and commitment. That's also the process of twisting the scriptures, which is done, again, around the world and can be done by everyone. Well, let's look at this path of twisted scripture for the innovation of the Lord's cups, for multiple cups in the Lord's church. Many, many years ago, the theories of health and what caused disease were quite interesting. Hippocrates had the four humors theory. Excess or deficiencies of four bodily fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow, and black bile. Now, if that was the theory of where health originates, then what do you treat, and how do you treat it? Well, they treated those things with purges, bloodletting, enemas, and vomits. It's like, what did you get at the doctor today? Well, I got a vomit. It's like, no. But if you look at this, how did this work? In 1799, the treatment for George Washington's illness was bloodletting. Up to half of his blood in just a few hours. He died at 67 under the care of the best medical professionals that our country had at the time. And this is the man that survived the Revolutionary War. Anytime there's disease, a disease outbreak, an illness, everyone naturally looks for a cause. And usually much that is supposed to be the cause is just that. It's a supposition. Once upon a time, it was believed that bad smells cause diseases. Miasma, go ahead and look that up. And it was, if it smells bad, it must be causing the disease. And so remember how often people bathed in centuries gone by? Well, it's not a big number. Sometimes it wasn't as much as 2 or 3 times a year, unless they had a stream nearby. But individuals just presumed if it smelled bad, it must be causing a disease. And this is the history through the centuries of mankind. And then the germ theory came along in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, and you'll recognize some of these names. And what they did was challenge every theory that ever had been offered in the medical world, and they also led to great speculation about what caused what. Now today, the Centers for Disease Control tells us what causes tuberculosis. That TB spreads through the air from one person to another. It can get into the air when someone with active TB disease coughs, speaks, or sings, and people nearby may breathe in these germs and become infected. But if you have inactive TB, you cannot spread those TB germs to others. Well, TB germs, again, according to the CDC, is shaking someone's hand, sharing food or drink, touching bed linens or toilet seats, sharing toothbrushes, kissing. TB germs are not spread by those things. Yet, in the late 1800s, all of these things and more were seen to be complicit in causing tuberculosis. And people were desperate to get rid of tuberculosis, of course, but also blamed was the common communion cup. So this is the Baltimore Sun, February 14, 1898. And they reported that the Indiana State Board of Health recommends the use of individual chalices, recommends the use of individual cups. It also recommends that the practice of using cups in common in the public schools be stopped. Well, some of you have never heard of a cup in common school, in a public school, or maybe you've never heard of a dipper that the family drinks out of. I was raised with our drinking water was in a bucket in the corner of the kitchen. We didn't have indoor plumbing. And so we had a bucket in the corner on the counter of the kitchen, and it had a dipper in it. If you wanted to drink, you went and got the dipper out of the bucket. That's what you took a drink of. And there are many people, my age and older, who are very accustomed and very comfortable with that. And there are still individuals today that drink out of streams around the world. And so the frequency with which we have problems with illness from water in our country is so rare that we often think that's not the case. Well, in those days, individuals thought, anything that touches may be causing tuberculosis. And so it says every sanitary principle forbids the common communion cup. Therefore, the Indiana State Board of Health earnestly recommends its abolition. It also recommends the abolition of the common drinking cup at schools and advises travelers to carry individual cups with them. Well, in Australia, a letter to the editor in 1908 said that individuals were starting to consider the transmission of contagious diseases by the communion cup, and that there were some churches in Sydney that had been willing to accept that change. This is, while it is admitted this is a delicate question to open up, owing chiefly to sacred sentiment connected with the partaking of the sacrament, yet it only requires to be calmly considered from a sanitary point of view, especially just now, to convince the most conservative that the dangers lurking in the common cup are neither imaginary nor exaggerated. Now that's good writing. That is really good writing. But it's not true. It's just not true. because there was no genuine health reason to change to multiple cups. In the late 1800s, there was hysteria over germs, and we know from others, modern studies, that there is no record of communicable disease spreading due to a common communion cup. Has never been documented. And when I stand in Africa and preach to people and I get asked these questions, I tell them simply, well, let's just look at the anecdotal evidence. There are thousands of congregations in other nations in Africa. They haven't all died, but yet they use and share one communion cup. And it's like, okay, no matter what you may have been told, no matter what you may think, there are thousands of people around the world. But in these years, in the late 1800s, there was hysteria over germs, which led to John G. Thomas patenting what ended up being this monstrosity. Now, in the days of germ fears, can you imagine trying to get this clean? It wouldn't have happened, and you know that. Now, where there's not refrigeration around the world, you can't keep grape juice from a large carton for several weeks and keep filling the cup with that. They have to start fresh. Well, this would have just had an accumulation of problems. But this led to the Thomas Communion Service Company. And this is a picture of their advertisement from 1914. And it says, "We were the originators of the individual communion service." Well, a little closer look at that says that communion service was now used by over 20,000 churches, and that it prevents the spread of contagious diseases, recommended by physicians and anti-tuberculosis societies and all other preventive organizations, and they started this. Well, who was first then among denominations to use individual cups? It was somewhere in the 1890s, but research has shown that the congregation in Lima, Ohio, normally attributed to be first, was just joining several others who had already done the same thing within denominations. However, in the Lord's church, we know when individual cups came in because G.C. Brewer says so in his book, 40 Years on the Firing Line. And in his autobiography, he graduated from Nashville Bible School in 1911 and moved to Chattanooga and was there for 5 years. And so somewhere when he was there in Chattanooga was when he began advocating the use of the individual communion cup. Now, he says, "Of course I was fought both privately and publicly, and several brethren took me to task in the religious papers and called me digressive. Brother Smith came to my rescue." And notice that is G. Dallas Smith. That is not Linwood Smith. And so it was a different Smith family that came to his rescue, as well as David Lipscomb through the Gospel Advocate. And the last paragraph that G.C. Brewer wrote was, "This brought the controversy to an end, and from then on the church began using the individual communion cup everywhere." Except to that statement we would say no and no. And what have we seen thus far? That not very long ago, individual communion cups were not known at all anywhere in the religious world. They were completely unknown in the Restoration movement in the Church of Christ until those years, 1911 to 1915. And we can find that some congregations may have used more than one cup, but it was certainly not out of a conviction from studying the Scriptures. In the Apostolic Way in 1918, and E.N. Glenn writes rather tongue-in-cheek, says, "The church in this former place is sick. This sickness is serious and fatal." Well, he wasn't talking about physical illness. He was talking about spiritual illness, because he says it began when the individual communion cups were introduced and classes in the Bible study. About 1918 is when the Spanish flu hit the world. And so the world was racked by the Spanish flu, and the impact in the United States was that a quarter of the population caught the virus. 675,000 died, and life expectancy dropped by 12 years. In the midst of that, there were individuals in the church who were saying, "We don't know what causes it, but we're going to change everything we possibly can." And there were innovators in the Lord's church doing that very carefully and systematically. Well, in the Apostolic Way, 1918, they mentioned the Gospel Advocate, and the editors then had endorsed voting on such things as whether or not to have individual cups in worship. And again, in 1920, there's a report of a congregation in Chicago where they had a difference. Should we commune with one cup or multiple cups? They decided to vote on it, and they decided as a compromise that they would have a tray, and on each tray would be a larger common cup, and then there would also be individual cups on the same tray. So they decided that would be the way to do it. Now, you may say, wow, 1920, they actually had those kinds of thoughts in 1920 to just compromise that everything can be okay? Yeah, they did. And that's not unusual. Because the Standard writer said this is a very happy solution of the perplexing problem and freely commends that course to other churches where the issue is forced upon them. Remember the path of innovation. Find a practice that's desired for some supposedly good reason, find scriptures to justify it, then justify and defend the change with passion and commitment. Well, where's the truth? The truth ends up not mattering. And if you've not studied with people enough to figure that out, it's very disheartening when you realize, trying to work with somebody, that what the Bible says means little to them. And yet, we still have the charge of doing our best to help individuals understand the path to salvation. So truth is soon left behind for a supposed greater good, and prior divisions in the Restoration movement by this time had already included instrumental music and Sunday school. And so this is what the church was fighting in these days. In 1920, there was a debate about the Lord's Supper. And this is referred to in George's site, in the Will of the Lord. In 1920, there was a Steigers-Kellum's debate. It was a written discussion. The proposition, the use of one cup for each individual in communion service is in harmony with the New Testament scriptures. Now that's careful wording, because it says it is in harmony. So it's saying it's not condemned. In other words, it's saying it doesn't say not to. Now, if you've ever studied with enough to get to that point, there's a lot of innovation in the world that has come in because it doesn't say not to. A lot of division among brethren. Well, it doesn't say not to this or that or the other. Well, here was Steiger's position. When the Lord's Supper was instituted, each person had their own cup. They filled themselves from Jesus' cup. And this had to do with how he believed the Passover meal was conducted in those days. After naming the items each person would have had, including their own cup, he says, a brother takes a loaf, not a tiny cake, and after returning thanks, breaks and gives to the disciples, or let each disciple break it for himself. He wasn't really sure on that. Then take the cup, the container in which the wine is placed, and return thanks for it, and start it around the disciples. All fill their cup, or as Luke puts it, divide among themselves, and then all drink this emblematic blood. Well, here was his argument. Jesus passed his cup, which would have been a large cup, he says, like a pitcher, and he used the word cupboard, for each person to use to fill their own cup. And he says this was the reasonable conclusion under ordinary circumstances of the Passover. He says that drinking after someone brings up clean versus unclean, that Peter spoke of in Acts 10, verse 13. And he said a request to drink from the same cup that the other 11 drank from would have called forth some similar remark. He brought up infectious disease. To drink from one cup is to tempt God, Matthew 4, verse 7. And he brought up order. He says, now the practice of all biting from one loaf or all drinking from one cup has never been according to order among any people who claim to be civilized. Now, can you imagine a group of God's people just taking a bite out of the loaf? It's like, well, I've never seen that, and neither had he, because that was not a practice anywhere. But that was an emphasis, an exaggeration in order to try to justify his practice. Well, the introduction to the debate is interesting. It says this individual communion cup question is a comparatively new issue. It had probably never been heard of 30 years ago, and that's true. In the Church of Christ, such a thing was never heard of until perhaps 10 years ago, and that's true. But like other innovations, it is growing fast, and it did grow fast. Well, after a few exchanges, the debate ended, and Steiger said, I gave up the argument in defense of the individual cups because I did not wish to try to prove that Jesus used individual cups on the night of the institution of the supper. I know this cannot be proved. He said, I am sure that using one cup will never displease the Lord. Well, in 1931, there was a Harper-Cowan debate, and we'll see how these innovations, justification progress. And the proposition was the word cup, used by Christ in Matthew 26:27, through to the vine are one and the same. And Cowan said, cup is the name of a literal vessel, but may be used to denote what is in the vessel, as he drank the poison cup and died, meaning he drank the liquid which was in the cup. Cowan says, I contend that Christ used the word in that sense in the verse cited. He took the cup, meaning the liquid, Cowan says, and gave thanks, and gave it unto them, saying, drink ye all of it, the liquid. For this cup, liquid, is my blood in the New Testament. And he also brought up the issue of the size of a crowd drinking out of one cup. And he mentioned something about pronouns and also about metonymy. When George wrote his notes on things like this, he answers those types of things. One example is Matthew 26, verse 29. I say to you, I will not drink of this fruit of the vine from now on until that day when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom. And the point of the debater was that the pronoun has to look back, always has to look back to a noun. And George proves by this, as is commonly known with study, that is not always the case. And certainly in this particular case, in Matthew chapter 26 and verse 29, we have the word this followed by what it refers to. And so what we end up then was an ongoing progression of knowledge and disagreement. In 1932, J.D. Phillips wrote the Cup of the Lord, which is an amazing book. This particular copy was the one that belonged to my great-grandparents, which is how they resisted whenever innovations like multiple cups came into the area where they lived in Knoll, Missouri, and they said no, and they used that material to help them with that. There was the Clark King debate in 1940. There was the Porter Waters debate in 1950. Irvin at that time was 32 years old when he engaged in that particular debate. There was the Wade-Lindsay debate in 1961. Ronnie Wade was 25 years old. And we look back at Ronnie Wade and say, well, he was always old. And many of you, he was. No, he wasn't. Once upon a time, he was a young man. And as a young man, he had studied and studied and studied these issues. And he was very familiar with the arguments made by those who used multiple cups. Here was the proposition. The scriptures permit an assembly of the Church of Christ for the communion to use individual drinking vessels in the distribution of the fruit of the vine. Well, the arguments that Lindsay made was, number one, the vessel means nothing. Number two, since the vessel is no part of the Lord's Supper, we may use as many vessels as we please. Number three, the fruit of the vine may be called a cup while in many vessels. And number four, Jesus has not bound upon Christians today that they must use only one vessel. Number five, God allows us to exercise our own judgment concerning how many vessels we use. And then he compares that to plate for the bread, a baptistry, songbooks, etc. In 1994, Alfred Newberry contributed greatly to help all of us in our studies with the Divine Pattern Advocate. 2011, Brett Hickey did the same with the Lord's Supper, unity in one loaf and one cup. And then George initially in 1994 and then updated in 2011 has his debate notes on individual cups. This is on his site, Will of the Lord. And if you don't know where this is, you need to know it. It is very, very helpful. And if you haven't thought of objections to how we observe the Lord's Supper, George has. And he's heard them all. And they're in there. And there are so many wonderful things in Brett's book to say, this is what we do. This is who we are. And can't we have unity here? Can't we have unity here? And it starts with the question, didn't Jesus use one loaf and one cup? Didn't Jesus use one loaf and one cup? And I've had people around the world say, no, many cups. You know why? Because that's what they've been told. That's exactly what they've been told. And they're shocked whenever someone dares to say that there was only one loaf and one cup. And then it's like once they learn that, well, maybe that was true, then they have to decide, did it matter? In 1932, the issues of the day, the issues of the day included multiple cups. It included Sunday school. Now, it didn't include instrumental music that much, but the editors and publishers and the preachers who contributed to the early editions of the Old Paz Advocate, they were trying to say, do we have a brotherhood or not? Do we have places where we can go that we can worship scripturally and depend on that? And they didn't know. They didn't have a nice directory in print or online, either one, to know for sure what to do. My grandfather wrote one time of going to a congregation that he'd heard was absolutely scriptural. And yes, they did indeed use one cup, but when he took his sip, it was fermented wine. He said, we came out of there smelling like a brewery. Now, what are you going to do when you don't know? You do the best you can. And so this system of communication had to include who is faithful, who is not. And how do we know? Who has been there? Who knows these people? And so still to this day, when somebody walks into our assembly, we do not automatically presume that everything is okay with them. We say, who do you know? And even if we're traveling and we walk into a place, we look to the people there and we say, who do you know? And we look to the Lord's table and say, how is it set? Because we know that these things are very, very important to us. Now, I hope among our preachers and leaders that knowledge abounds on the issues surrounding the Lord's Supper. I hope we've all diligently studied how the Lord's Supper was instituted, how it was changed to introduce pre-broken bread and multiple cups, how those changes are not authorized in the Scriptures, they are sinful, and that no fellowship exists where the Lord's Supper is not observed according to the pattern Jesus established, with one unbroken loaf of unleavened bread and one cup, a drinking vessel containing grape juice from which each participant partakes. I also know many among us have that much knowledge, but may not have ever had opportunity to use it. Now, I don't claim to have a lot of knowledge in anything, but the last few years I have had a lot of exchanges with individuals around the world who use multiple cups, so I'll share a bit of that. This was a report after my son-in-law Justin Owen and I went to Uganda for the first time in August 2023. And my report says 60 had been baptized by the end of our studies in Uganda after Justin and I left the country. Matthew and Tom, two of our leaders there, took several days to revisit some of the areas where we had been on their way home to Luwero. 66 more were baptized on their journey. When we arrived in Uganda the end of July, we had no congregations worshiping correctly. We now, as of August 2023, have 20 plus congregations in the Church of Christ committed to worshiping correctly. We have registered with the government, and the last sentence says most of these have been multiple cup congregations. So in less than a month's time, we went from no congregations worshiping correctly to what we thought at the time would be at least 20 or more. Well, as word spread that we were in the country and what we were preaching, people started to comment. And so there were comments from people in the United States. And a question was asked to a man in the United States, a member of the Multiple Cup Church. We had doctrinal controversy brought by some missionaries in Uganda, that would have been about me and my son-in-law Justin, who taught about using only one cup for partaking the fruit of the vine. And then he said, I know of only two elements, fruit of the vine and unleavened bread. Well, here was the response summary that this man posted, this man, a member of the Multiple Cup Church in the United States. This teaching is placing a sole emphasis on the physical vessel instead of the content of the cup. To divide a cup, the cup would soon be gone. It makes the cup an idol. Must the fruit of the vine be gathered from one vine? Where's the one cup we are to use, and how do we share it? The cup means nothing. It is the fruit of the vine that Jesus said, divide not the cup. The cup isn't anything but a vessel to contain the emblem of the fruit of the vine. Brothers and sisters, he said, stop this foolishness and serve God and keep his commandments, not those of men. So once this was posted, here was the response from various places around the world. I think what matters is content, not container. Also, what matters is the purpose of doing it and its spiritual significance to Christians. But once you major on one cup rather than content, you are missing the mark. Grace and peace. Thank you so much for clarifying the issue, brother. Your clarification and sound doctrine make you qualified to visit where this fellow was in Uganda. Sound message. I appreciate. Another person from the United States weighed in on this and actually named me in his comments, so I know he was talking about me. I provide the following for our Uganda brethren who are now being influenced by Greg Gay in his effort to teach this false doctrine. Well, he had a view, didn't he? He says, must we just use one cup in the Lord's Supper? How do you defend the use of multiple cups against the Lord during the Lord's Supper against one cupper stand that all references in the New Testament refer to the cup as a pattern? And then he gave his answer, which had these arguments. To use one cup would be one container for the world. How is it possible for all the congregations in the world to use only one container? He rejects one cup per congregation. To respond that it is permissible to use one container per congregation is to give up the argument for one container. The error made by those who contend for one container is in their misunderstanding of the word cup as it is used in the institution of the Lord's Supper. He refers to metonymy. He says the cup in verse 27 of Matthew 26 was the fruit of the vine, and to use grape juice is to use one cup. So sometimes when you're talking to people and you say to them, do you use one cup? Yes. Yes. Are they talking about the vessel, a drinking vessel? No. They're just talking about using grape juice. Well, this U.S. preacher copied word for word from thywordIstruth.com. I don't think he changed a single word. And it's their question number 87, and that's a site that's been around for a long time. Well, here were the responses that were posted after that error. We are going to defend. Remember, it was like, what do you do about me coming to Uganda? We're going to defend. Good explanation. That's spot on. Nothing beyond this about fruit of the vine and the container. If the container was important, then we should be guided to the Bible of how to get the very container that was used in Jerusalem. You have perfectly explained what is important. Thanks for sharing this here. The one cup persuasion has reached also my country, Philippines. It's simple. How do you drink a cup? Answer, you don't. You drink the contents. Sometimes there's a glimmer of truth in the midst of all of this. Well, wonderful explanation, someone says. Another one says, it's clear. If someone advocates for the real cup container, then his followers should be chewing the container. How crazy. I was at a congregation one time. We'd grown beyond the capacity 1 cup supplied, so they had 2 cups. Yes, this fellow's name was Tom. In reality, each congregation that practices 1 cup have 1 cup, but they have a plurality of congregations that have 1 cup, so they are also worshiping with many cups. Someone else said, excellent response. This one says, brother, thank you for bringing this sound lesson to help those brethren and others who are struggling with that error. To put 1-cuppers to silence, it needs some rudeness a bit because they don't reason at all. For example, if Jesus blessed the container and Jesus made them drink the container, therefore utensils are consumable. If Jesus changed the law by nature by blessing the container to be something to be eaten because he was God, and the cup was eaten/drunk by the disciples, therefore it must have reduced to some percentage in size, or it was no more. Did Jesus bless another one after the end of the first one? Did they still have the original cup which Jesus carried on his hand? Okay, so this is the type of stuff that I've seen online since all of these things started. Somebody says, don't be afraid about me coming to Uganda because the brethren there have demonstrated the highest ability to defend sound doctrine. And they also said, we are ready to confront Greg Gay and teach him the truth. They were ready for that. Well, I was never confronted, arrested once, but never confronted by anyone that dared to stand up in the presentations. Those comments, though, were from a year ago. Well, since that initial visit where we ended up with 20 or so congregations that had agreed to worship correctly, who had been multiple cups, after another several trips, by the end of the year, we now have 184 congregations there, and we've had over 3,700 baptisms. Now, those did not happen in the areas where we had many multiple cup congregations. And we've preached in kind of a band from west to east in that country. In the west, we still have about 20 congregations, maybe. The rest of the country is growing rapidly. How could that be? Well, the west is the home of a Bible college. And that Bible college cares little about truth and everything about power. Everything about who they have in their circle of influence. And so they have worked very, very hard to make it extremely difficult for anyone to break away. So in the West, you have the Bible college, and the study attendees from the West, whenever I go there, because I go there every time, and the study attendees say, you must be here to give me money. I want funds. And sometimes they'll have this elaborate written document. I want funds for transport, money for campaigns, buildings, preacher support, chairs, grape juice, Bibles, anything I need, you're here to give it to me. To the point that Justin, my son-in-law, says, we are not banks with legs. We are not banks with legs. We're not here to give you money. But some there are there to learn. And after one study, last time I was there were some representatives from a congregation. At the end of the second day, they stood up and said, we have understood your teaching, and we are going to use 1 cup in our congregation from now on. And that was while others were still debating and looking sideways at each other, because I don't know for sure that they had made that decision. But those people did. In the East, attendees walk from 1 to 3 hours to attend our studies. They appear to be eager to learn and eager to obey. And their request is simply this: once they obey the gospel, they realize they cannot go back to their denominations, and they say, where can we gather for worship? And it's against the law in the nation of Uganda for a church to meet in a home. And that's caused a tremendous expense for that work there. Unusual ethics among those who are religious. In the West, some said we practice 1 cup, but don't tell anybody. Don't post any pictures. Others will say, if you'll just start paying me, I'll change to 1 cup. I see what you're saying. I know what it is. Just start paying me. I agree. I want to visit with you, but man, I can't be seen. Well, we do use 1 cup, but we lost our building, or I lost my support. Can you give me money? So at first I said yes, and we gave some very limited support for a very limited time to some individuals, and then things like this started happening, where somebody wrote a fellow in the United States who had said, is there any needs in your nation? This one fellow who was one of our preachers and was being supported, and it's a small amount, but he was one of our preachers and being supported. He said, no, any source of support that I get. He says, I don't get any money from anybody. I don't get anything from anybody. And then he says, wonderful clarification, brother. That brother just blasted anybody that uses 1 cup. And our preacher says, wonderful clarification, brother. Them being deceived here in Africa invite you to at least one time organize for a trip for studies, mostly in Uganda. Well, he says he didn't get any support. So I talked to him. And I said, brother, you're a prophet. You've been getting support, but you say you don't get any support. You don't get any now from us. Because his support was cut off that day. It's like, so when you've been lied to and lied about, it kind of tends to make you jaded. Who do you trust? Now, there was a college in the East where we had studies for a day, and I talked to the head of that college, and he credits Alfred Newberry's materials for convincing him to use only one cup. He says, we only use one cup. But then we later, some of my entourage, talked to the students, and they said, we don't use one cup. It's like, what is this? So remember, some people say the cup is just the grape juice. Was that the game he was playing with me? I have no idea. I share pictures of the Lord's Supper on social media every Lord's Day. And I share that with various groups around the world, various WhatsApp groups around the world, because this distinguishes us from everyone else. And that cup may be plastic in Africa, and usually is, but the fact that the Lord's table is set with one loaf and one cup with grape juice is a distinguishing characteristic of who we are. This was another picture that I posted. Well, some people seeing these pictures where I posted them, I get these kind of remarks. Oh, on the Lord's table there was 13 cups. Greg Gay, it is not the cup, it is the content, the fruit of the vine. We have brothers and sisters that go with one cup, one fellow said. Where I go, we have many cup. My brothers and sisters are using one cup. If they endure to the end, they're going to be in heaven with me. And so that he encouraged, play a little softball. Just get together and play softball. And that will take care of all of it when it's in love. Well, this is also considered to be postmodernism. Because whenever you say, we'll just coexist. Everything will be fine together. Well, except that's not really the way the Bible teaches us. So another posted comment, what if the universal church wants to drink in the same cup of which the Lord instituted? How will you handle this? For how can one cup serve thousands with the church building on Sunday? Brother, common sense matters here. When Christ meant of the cup, he didn't mean the container, but the content within the container. Others say, I agree with you. Others say, let us speak where the Bible speaks. There was one who said, there was a time I told Brother Greg Gay that I will fellowship him all the proponents of one cup if they don't preach it as a doctrine. So if they say it's a doctrine, then I will not fellowship them. And another one said, well, it's just not safe. It's just not clean. To which I replied. One of our congregations in Uganda is at the top of a mountain. Brother Bwacha Yofesi began using one cup and one loaf from the time that we first went there. And he's continued faithfully. And the place where he worshiped was evidently built with money from the multiple cup brethren, and they asked him to leave. And he said, no, I was here before you, no. And so they asked him to leave again. He said, no. Now this is a place where the car can only go so far, and then they find a scooter for me to ride on the back of a little scooter, and that's an interesting thing. And then you still have to get off and walk whenever the hills are too steep. And so from the top of that mountain, we had this little building. And this was Justin. We were having the Lord's Supper correctly there for the first time. And Brother Yofesi, preacher with that congregation. And he was disfellowshipped. Not for staying on land that supposedly belonged to somebody else, but for using one cup. And it says, this is to inform the Church of Christ all over the world that Brother Bwacha Yofesi has been disfellowshipped by the above congregation where he has had his membership. This brother has come up with a false doctrine of one cup at the Lord's Supper. The church has done all biblical means to get him out of this error, but all in vain. Therefore, if anyone may work with him, do it on a friendly basis, not as a faithful brother. So in discussions with brethren there who use multiple cups, some things seem to make little or no difference. It doesn't make any difference to them that multiple cups are new, or that the singular words for loaf and cup are parallel to a singular body and a singular testament. It makes no difference that Jesus said this cup does have meaning. It represents the New Testament. The definition and proper application of metonymy seems to make no difference. Following Jesus' example of instituting the supper with one loaf and one cup seems not to matter, but what does matter is what they've been told by the multiple cup preachers, and it seems in some cases they have been given money. And individuals have actually gone to some of our leaders' homes, knocked on the door, and said, we will give you money if you will leave this one cup group. And some of our leaders have recordings of phone calls where the person has said, well, you're leading this one cup group, and we want you to stop that, and here's the support, here's the money that we have for you. Well, those are the types of things that let us know the errors from the early 1900s continue. The explanations that I use are very simple. The reason for that is because I am very simple, and I'm going to do the best I can with the tools that I have. So I focus on the small words in the Lord's Supper. The word took means to grasp, to hold. The word gave means to hand to someone. And so in the Lord's Supper, as they were eating, Jesus took bread, blessed and broke it, and gave it to the disciples. And then he took the cup, gave thanks, gave it to them, saying, drink from it, all of you. And so Jesus took a loaf. Jesus gave the loaf he was holding to someone else. Jesus took a cup containing grape juice. Jesus gave the cup he was holding to someone else. Well, what did he do in between? Well, with the loaf, he prayed. He broke off a piece. He ate it. He then passed the loaf he was holding to the next person to do the same. With the cup, he prayed. He sipped, then passed the cup he was holding to the next person for them to drink. Now, understand, when I'm talking to an audience in the West, I'm talking to people who may be there to learn, and I'm also talking to people who may be spies to see who showed up. And so I will do something like this. I will say, now some of you here don't believe what I've just said. And some of you say, because you've been told this, the cup doesn't matter. The cup doesn't matter. But yet you need to pass the Lord's Supper somehow. So if the cup doesn't matter, how are you going to pass this? And then I just pour water on the ground because it's a dirt floor. How are you going to pass this? And they look at me like, wait. Go ahead and pass the grape juice without a cup, without a container. How do you do that? And I said, you've got an impossibility, because the cup Jesus took is the cup Jesus gave. And I take a long time to explain this. I say, now we're not going to let go of the bread until Jesus did. Jesus took bread. We can't let go of it till he did. When did he give it to somebody? Well, he had to bless it, and he had to break it. Well, what does that mean? Break can mean many things, including take a piece off and eat. Break a piece off and eat, and that's what he did. And then he gave it to the next person to do what? To break off their piece. Now, if Jesus just broke the loaf in a lot of pieces and said, here you go, the other person's going to say, where's my loaf to break into pieces? And nobody eats. Nobody eats if you do that. So the cup, the bread he took, the bread he gave. Now let's take the cup. We can't let go of it till Jesus did. What do we do with it? We pray. We sip. Do we take time to pour it out? No. Was it pre-poured? No, because he had to take a cup. And what is a cup? It's a drinking vessel. Always has been. Always will be. And that same drinking vessel that he took is the drinking vessel he passed, the drinking vessel he gave. You cannot make this a different drinking vessel than the one Jesus took. You cannot make this a different bread than the bread Jesus took. And so that's my simple explanation. And there will be people that will listen to that, and they will say, no, that can't be. And the reason it can't be is because they've never heard of it. They've just never heard it. Recent conversations, someone said using one cup is no sin. Using multiple cups is no sin as long as you will bless the wine that is inside the cups. Or inside the cup, I will continue to say grape juice is valuable than the cup, or cups, the cup is determined as an expedient. And I've been sending questions to people within the last couple of weeks just to be ready for this. Another one said, if you still hold your mind of teaching a matter of opinion as doctrine, I will continue saying that you, Justin Owen, Matt Trent, and your other fellows are liars. Secondly, see, you said that you converted 150 to your false doctrine. We had at one point. Yet just your followers don't exceed 50 by then, and now they have been drastically reduced. Well, are these authors of these negative comments ready to obey the truth? Not yet. Not yet. But they may someday. In the meantime, I plan to go back to the West, gather our preachers together, tell them to invite whoever they want that they think is ready to hear the truth on the Lord's Supper, and I'll continue to study with them, even as our preachers all over that country are starting to suffer persecution from many there. And then, Lord willing, I'll head to the East to strengthen the saved and attempt to teach them to stay strong. And right now, as far as I know from what I've heard in the East, we have another dozen groups at least that are ready to hear the gospel and become members of the Church of Christ. And that's why I could say in the month of August, we baptized over 1,800 people in one visit. There's an open door for the gospel in the East. I'm not going to spend all of my time in the West, but I love those people, and I want to help them if I can. But if they won't be helped, I will still go to them and try to tell them the truth. But remember, it was finally agreed by this one group that long time ago, we'll just have both. And it's like, no, that's not what we do.